It was a warm summer afternoon in the small town of Clearwater, Florida. The sun cast a golden hue over the town, and the sound of chirping birds filled the air. For many of the locals, the town represented peace, community, and faith. At the heart of this town stood Pastor Samuel Jacobs, the charismatic leader of a thriving church, whose life appeared to be the embodiment of virtue. He was respected by all, his sermons were inspiring, and his family, a picture of perfection. His wife, Natalie Jacobs, was the epitome of grace, often seen at her husband's side during church events. Their twin children, Emily and Ethan, were 17, well-mannered, and adored by everyone in the congregation. To the outside world, the Jacobs family was perfect. But behind the closed doors of the Jacobs home, everything was beginning to unravel. Natalie had always trusted her husband, Samuel. They had been married for over 20 years, and while their marriage was never without its challenges, they had worked through them together. But recently, things had started to feel different. Samuel had been distant, often disappearing late at night, claiming to be busy with church-related activities or community meetings. Natalie, initially too trusting, had let it slide. However, the nagging feeling in her gut began to grow, and one evening, she decided to confront him. That night after dinner, Samuel had left for one of his meetings, as usual, but this time Natalie decided to follow him. She knew something was off. Her intuition told her he was hiding something, and she wasn't about to ignore it any longer. She quietly followed him out of the house, keeping a safe distance, as he drove to a secluded motel on the outskirts of Clearwater. Her heart pounded as she parked across the street from the motel. From her car, she could see Samuel entering the motel with a woman by his side. But that wasn't all. Two other figures followed them into the building, both of them twins. One was Emily, her daughter, and the other was Ethan, her son. Natalie's world crumbled in that instant. She had caught her husband and children in a twisted web of infidelity. The sight of them entering that motel, the realization of what was happening inside, was enough to shatter everything Natalie had known about her family. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she sat in the car, stunned, her mind racing with disbelief. What happened next was a blur. Natalie didn't know how long she had been sitting there before she found the strength to leave. She drove back home, tears streaming down her face, her heart heavy with betrayal. The first thing she did when she arrived home was pick up the phone and dial 911. "Help, my husband, my children, they've, they've been unfaithful. Please, I need help," she sobbed, barely able to form coherent sentences. The police arrived at the Jacobs residence within minutes, but Natalie's mind was a whirlwind. She couldn't even speak to them properly. She was caught in the whirlwind of her emotions, unsure what to do next. Would she confront Samuel? Would she tell him what she saw? Or would she remain silent and bear the weight of the knowledge alone? That night, as the house grew quiet and the police investigation began to unfold, Samuel returned home. He walked in calmly, acting as though nothing had happened. He was unaware that his wife had already seen everything. Samuel had his own version of the truth, and to him, this affair with his children and the woman was a hidden part of his life, a world far removed from the one his wife and church knew. He didn't know that the truth would soon be laid bare. And then, in the dead of night, Natalie made a decision. Her world had shattered, and in that moment of pain and betrayal, she decided she would never allow anyone to destroy her family's reputation. She would silence the truth. And she did. That same night, Natalie took matters into her own hands, ensuring the family's secret remained buried forever. The next morning, Pastor Samuel Jacobs was found dead in their home. The police initially ruled it an accident, an overdose. But something didn't sit right with the lead investigator, Detective Claire Daniels. She was an experienced officer, and she could sense that the perfect family facade had just cracked wide open. The truth was about to come to light, and Natalie's silence was about to unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. Detective Daniels would stop at nothing to uncover the truth hidden behind the walls of the Jacobs home. Detective Claire Daniels stood in the middle of the Jacobs living room, her eyes scanning the scene. The house was immaculate, as expected from the family of Pastor Samuel Jacobs. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, and every decoration screamed perfection, an image of a happy family living the ideal life. But something was off. The perfect facade hid a darkness that Daniels was determined to uncover. The police had arrived at the Jacobs house early that morning, responding to a call made by Natalie herself, claiming that her husband had passed away in his sleep from an apparent overdose. Samuel Jacobs had been a prominent figure in the community, a well-respected pastor with a loyal congregation. The idea that he had died from a drug overdose was difficult to believe, but Daniels had learned long ago never to accept anything at face value. The medical examiner's preliminary report was inconclusive. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious cause of death, just the body of a man who appeared to have died in his sleep. Daniels, however, knew that there was more to the story. It felt too clean, too controlled. She had heard rumors, whispers from church members, distant relatives, and even the police officers who had first arrived at the scene. Everyone had something to say about Pastor Jacobs, but it wasn't what they had known about his public life that intrigued her. It was the personal details, the things that were never discussed openly. Some said he was a bit too controlling of his family. Others mentioned how the children had become increasingly distant from their father in the last few months. No one dared to speak ill of the beloved pastor, but in the quiet corners of the investigation, it was clear that Samuel Jacobs was not the man he appeared to be. Detective Daniels' first priority was to speak with Natalie. The grieving wife, who had been visibly distraught when the authorities arrived at the scene, was now alone in the living room staring at the framed photo of her family on the mantel. She hadn't said much to the police, and Daniels could sense the reluctance in her demeanor. But something about Natalie's silence spoke volumes. There was a coldness about her, a calmness that didn't match the grief one would expect from someone who had just lost her husband. "Mrs. Jacobs," Daniels began, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions." Natalie's eyes flickered up to meet Daniels, and for a moment there was a flash of something, guilt, perhaps, or shame, but it was gone before Daniels could fully place it. "I understand," Natalie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She sat down slowly on the couch, smoothing her dress with her hands. "I know you have to do your job. I'll answer whatever I can." Daniels took a seat across from her, keeping her tone compassionate but direct. "Can you tell me about the events leading up to your husband's death? What was he like last night? Was there anything unusual?" Natalie paused for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window. She was composed, but her hands were trembling slightly. "Samuel, he was always so busy. There was always something, meetings, church events, counseling people. He worked late into the night sometimes. But last night, it was quiet. He didn't go out. We just spent some time together before bed. He was fine. Nothing seemed wrong." Daniels nodded, her mind processing the details. "And did he have any health problems? Any history of substance abuse?" Natalie looked down at her hands, her face slightly flushed. "No, no problems at all. He was in perfect health. We've always taken care of ourselves." There was a slight hesitation in her voice, an edge to her words that Daniels noted. "Are you sure? Because the preliminary report suggests that there might be more to his death than just natural causes." Natalie stiffened at the mention of the report. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "Are you saying it wasn't an accident?" Daniels held her gaze steadily. "We haven't ruled anything out yet, Mrs. Jacobs, but I want to understand everything that happened. It's important." Natalie's face was a mask of composure, but Daniels could see the anxiety behind her eyes. She was hiding something, and Daniels knew that getting to the truth would require more than just a simple interview. After her conversation with Natalie, Detective Daniels decided to speak with the children, twins Emily and Ethan. They were still in shock from the death of their father, but Daniels needed to understand their perspective. The kids had always been described as quiet and well-behaved, but their behavior in the days leading up to Samuel's death had been strange. They had seemed distant, withdrawn, and perhaps even fearful of their father. Emily, the older twin by a few minutes, was sitting on the porch when Daniels approached her. She looked up with wide eyes, her expression vacant. She was still wearing the clothes she had slept in, and her hair was unkempt. Her brother Ethan was sitting inside, his face buried in his hands. Both of them seemed as though they had just woken up from a nightmare they couldn't escape. Emily, Daniels began gently, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions about your father. Can you tell me about last night? What happened? Emily didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered to the ground as though she was unsure how to speak. Then finally she looked up at Daniels. He was, fine. He was just himself. Nothing different. He always seemed to have so much to do, so much to deal with. But last night he seemed tired, you know? He wasn't as energetic as usual. But he didn't say anything. He didn't look sick. He just... Emily trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. Daniels pressed further. Do you know if your father was involved in anything unusual? Any problems with people? Any secrets? Emily's face tightened and she looked away as though she was trying to push back memories. He was always so secretive about some things. He was always a little too private. I don't know, I think maybe he was trying to hide something, but I didn't understand what. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. Emily knew more than she was letting on, but she wasn't ready to talk. The walls were slowly coming down, but it would take time. After speaking to Emily and Ethan, Detective Daniels felt the weight of the case press down on her even more. Something was amiss in the Jacobs family. Samuel Jacobs wasn't the man the town thought he was. Beneath the facade of the perfect pastor, something darker had been festering for years. Daniels had no doubt now that Samuel's death was not an accident. It was murder. And as she pieced together the fragmented testimonies of the family, one thing became clear. Natalie Jacobs wasn't as innocent as she appeared. As Daniels left the Jacobs home, she could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the secrets that had been hidden for far too long. She was getting closer to the truth, but there was still so much left to uncover. The perfect family was anything but perfect, and the investigation was just beginning. In the back of her mind, Daniels knew one thing. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous this case would become. The days following Detective Claire Daniels' initial interviews with Natalie and the twins only deepened the mystery surrounding Samuel Jacobs' death. While Natalie maintained her story of a peaceful night and a sudden, tragic overdose, Daniels could feel that there was something hidden beneath the surface, something Natalie wasn't sharing, and something the children weren't saying. In the quiet of her office, surrounded by her notes, the detective felt the case becoming more like a tangled knot, with each thread pulling in different directions. The next step was clear. She needed to find out more about Pastor Samuel Jacobs, the man behind the pulpit in the family facade. If Natalie and the children weren't going to be forthcoming, maybe others around the pastor could shed light on the man he had truly been. Samuel was a respected leader, but behind closed doors, what kind of man had he really been? Daniels made a plan to speak with some of the church members and people who had known Samuel personally. Her first visit was to the local church, a massive building that was filled with parishioners every Sunday, yet seemed eerily quiet in the absence of service. Inside, she was greeted by a middle-aged woman named Maria, who was one of the church volunteers. Maria spoke fondly of Samuel, remembering him as a kind, compassionate leader who always took time to counsel others, especially during personal struggles. But as the conversation continued, Maria seemed to drop subtle hints that Samuel wasn't as perfect as he appeared. She mentioned that the pastor had been distant in recent months, often disappearing after church services or meetings, and that people had begun noticing his absence more frequently. Do you think something was wrong with him? Daniels asked carefully, watching Maria closely. Maria hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know. He seemed different. I think his family knew more about it than anyone else. He had a lot on his plate with church stuff, but there were whispers. Not everyone could see it, but he was pushing people away, even his own family. Maria's words were enough to raise a red flag for Daniels. It was clear that Samuel had been hiding something, and the deeper Daniels dug, the more likely it seemed that it wasn't just a passing issue. It was a long-standing problem that had been affecting his marriage and family life. But the question remained, what had caused it, and how deep did the deception go? The next lead came from Pastor Samuel's assistant, a young woman named Sarah. When Daniels met her at a nearby coffee shop, she seemed nervous, glancing around every few seconds, as though afraid someone might be watching. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Daniels asked, her voice gentle. Sarah nodded, but her anxiety was palpable. "I've been asked not to talk much about Samuel, but I can't keep quiet anymore. Things weren't what they seemed." Daniels leaned in, her gaze steady and patient. "What do you mean? What wasn't what it seemed?" "I was Samuel's assistant for over 2 years," Sarah began, her voice shaky but gaining strength as she spoke. "I've seen a lot of things that don't add up. People think he was this perfect man of God, but he wasn't. He was manipulative. He had this control over everyone, especially his family." Daniels listened carefully, sensing the weight of Sarah's words. "What kind of control?" "He was obsessed with perfection. He demanded it from his family, his wife, his kids, his congregation. But there was also something more. It wasn't just about being a good pastor or a good father. He had affairs. Not just one, but multiple. And he wasn't discreet about it. He was having relationships with people from the congregation, and it wasn't just with women." Daniel sat back in her chair, her mind spinning with the implications. "You're saying he was having an affair with his own children?" Sarah swallowed hard, visibly shaken by her own revelation. "Not exactly, but he had relationships with people close to his family, people in his inner circle. He even tried to involve Emily and Ethan. I don't know the details, but there were inappropriate interactions. I heard things, but I didn't want to believe it." Daniels felt the blood drain from her face. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Samuel had been leading a double life. On the surface, he was a revered pastor, a man of faith and moral authority. But behind closed doors, he was a predator, manipulating the people around him to fulfill his desires, including his own children. Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon gathering as much information as she could. The more she learned about Samuel, the more disgusted she became. His affair with members of the church had been well known among some of the staff, but no one had dared speak out, too afraid to tarnish the revered image of the pastor. And now, in the wake of his death, it was all beginning to unravel. The next step was to confront Natalie. She had remained steadfast in her story, but Daniels knew that she was hiding something crucial. The pieces of this puzzle couldn't fit unless Natalie revealed the truth about her husband's actions. The following day, Daniels returned to the Jacobs home. Natalie was sitting in the living room again, as if waiting for Daniels to arrive. The quiet tension between them was thick, and Natalie didn't greet Daniels with the same coldness as before. Instead, there was something more resigned in her demeanor, as though she had known this conversation would come. "I know what you're trying to do," Natalie said, her voice low but firm. "You think Samuel's death wasn't an accident, don't you?" Daniels nodded carefully. "I think there's more to it than we've been told. You don't have to hide it anymore." "What happened, Natalie? What was going on with your husband? What are you not telling me?" Natalie's eyes welled up with tears, but she fought them back. "I didn't know how to stop him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He wasn't the man I thought he was, and I didn't want anyone to know. Not the kids, not the church. I thought if I kept up the illusion, everything would be okay. But it wasn't. It was never okay." Daniel's heart pounded as she realized the weight of what Natalie was saying. "You knew, didn't you? About the affairs? About what he was doing with your children?" Natalie closed her eyes, nodding slowly. "Yes, I knew. I found out months ago. I caught him once, and it destroyed me. But I didn't know how to stop him. I thought I could make it go away. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all disappear." Daniel's voice softened, but it remained steady. "You didn't have to do it this way, Natalie. You didn't have to kill him." Natalie broke down in tears, her sobs racking her body. "He didn't leave me any choice. I couldn't let him ruin the children's lives any further. I couldn't let him destroy them. I thought that if I silenced him, if I stopped him once and for all, everything would be okay." It was clear now. Natalie had made the decision to silence Samuel for good. After finding out about the affair and the manipulations, she had taken matters into her own hands. She had to end it, even if it meant destroying her family. Detective Daniels stepped away from the confrontation with a heavy heart. The truth was now out in the open. Pastor Samuel Jacobs had led a double life, one filled with betrayal, manipulation, and horrors that even his closest family had been blind to. Natalie had done what she believed was necessary to protect her children, to protect the family she thought she could save. But in doing so, she had committed an irreversible act. She had killed her husband, and with it, everything they had built together. As Daniels prepared to close the case, she realized that the price of keeping up appearances, of maintaining a perfect image, had come at the cost of everything real. The perfect pastor, the perfect family, none of it had been real, and now the shattered pieces of their lives would forever be scattered in the wake of a secret too terrible to bear. This case, like so many others, was a reminder that things were never as they seemed, and that the truth, when uncovered, was often far more painful than the lies that held it together. Detective Claire Daniels walked out of the Jacobs house, her mind heavy with the confession she had just extracted from Natalie. The pieces of the case were coming together, but it felt like walking through a fog. Samuel Jacobs had been a man of power and influence, revered by his community, but behind that mask was a dark, twisted reality. Natalie had tried to protect her children, and in doing so, she had made a devastating choice, one that had ended her husband's life. Daniels wasn't sure what to make of Natalie's confession. It was clear that the woman was deeply conflicted, trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret, but she had made the decision to murder her husband, believing that it was the only way to stop the destruction he was causing. Whether it was out of love or fear, didn't change the fact that Samuel Jacobs was dead, and Natalie's involvement in his death was undeniable. But there was one more piece of the puzzle to uncover. Natalie had said she caught Samuel in the act, but there was no clarity on how exactly he had died. Had it been an accident? Was it premeditated? The details of his death were still murky. Natalie had insisted that she didn't plan it, but Daniels had learned enough to know that there was more to the story. The next day, Daniels returned to the local police department to review the autopsy results. The medical examiner had ruled Samuel's cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, but there were inconsistencies. The body had shown signs of a struggle, which suggested that Samuel may have fought back before he died. Natalie's initial story, that he had died peacefully in his sleep, simply didn't match the evidence. The lack of signs of overdose was another red flag. There had been no trace of drugs in Samuel's system, only the brutal, violent marks of an altercation. The more Daniels thought about it, the more it seemed that Natalie had attacked Samuel in a moment of rage, triggered by his betrayal. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to end a cycle of pain that had been festering for months, perhaps years. But had she acted alone? Daniels met with Officer Rodriguez, the lead detective assigned to the case, to discuss the next steps in the investigation. "Rodriguez," Daniels said, her voice calm but determined, "I need you to go back and dig deeper into Samuel's personal life. I know Natalie's told us some of the truth, but there's something off about her story. We need to know if anyone else was involved, whether she had help." Rodriguez nodded, making notes in his pad. "You think she didn't do it alone?" "I don't know," Daniel said, "but the evidence doesn't add up. There's a chance she could have been helped. She's admitted to being emotionally torn about the situation. I'm sure she was under immense pressure, but someone had to have known what was going on inside that house." Daniels knew she couldn't rely solely on what Natalie had said. As the investigation deepened, she decided to talk to Emily and Ethan, Samuel's children. Both had been distant from their father recently, and the tension between the family members was palpable. Daniels wasn't convinced that the twins were entirely innocent in this web of deceit, but she needed to hear their side of the story. The twins had been staying at a relative's house since the incident, and Daniels knew that it was time to confront them. Emily, who was more outspoken, was the first to agree to meet with Daniels. She sat in a small interview room at the police station, her posture stiff, her eyes red from crying. Her twin brother, Ethan, sat beside her, his face unreadable. "Emily, Ethan," Daniels began, her tone soft yet direct. "I know this is hard, but I need to ask you about your father. What happened that night?" Emily's lips trembled as she looked down at her hands. I, I don't know. I wasn't there," she said, her voice shaky. "I wasn't home when it happened." Ethan's eyes narrowed, and his voice was quieter. more guarded. "We didn't do anything," he said, almost defensively. "We weren't part of it." Daniel studied them carefully. There was something about their responses that didn't sit right with her. Their stories didn't match what she knew about the night Samuel had died. Emily's reaction seemed too detached, and Ethan was avoiding eye contact, as if hiding something. It was clear they weren't telling her everything. "I know this is hard," Daniel said, "but if you're hiding something, if you know anything about what happened that night, you need to tell me. Your family is in pieces, and the truth will set things right." For a long moment, there was silence. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, then looked up at Daniels with a mixture of fear and guilt. I, I don't know if I can say it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Say what?" Daniels pressed gently. Emily took a shaky breath. We, we knew something was wrong. My mom, she didn't tell us everything. But we saw things. We saw Dad with other people, with people who weren't Mom. I didn't know what to do, and then everything just fell apart. Daniels felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The twins had known about their father's affairs, but that wasn't all. There was more to the story than she could have imagined. "You saw him with other people?" Daniels asked, her voice even. "Who?" Emily glanced at Ethan, who shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "It was with Mom's friend, and sometimes other women. But we didn't know about the rest. We didn't know what happened between them and our dad. Not until the night he died." Daniels held her breath as she processed the information. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was something more twisted, a secret the entire family had been forced to carry. But there was still one crucial piece of the puzzle missing. What had truly happened on the night of Samuel's death? The truth was beginning to surface, but it wasn't just about one man's betrayal. It was about the family's secrets, buried under layers of shame, guilt, and manipulation. As Daniels pieced the story together, she began to realize that the murder of Pastor Samuel Jacobs was not just a crime of passion. It was the tragic result of years of secrecy, control, and ultimately, desperation. As the investigation continued, Daniels was sure that the answers she was looking for were hidden in plain sight. The question was whether the Jacobs family, particularly Natalie, was ready to confront the truth, or whether they would remain locked in their web of lies, forever changed by the secrets they had tried so hard to keep. The investigation had turned from a simple case of family tragedy into a deep dive into the complexities of betrayal, control, and manipulation. Detective Daniels knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She was getting closer to the truth, but the final revelation would be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Detective Claire Daniels sat at her desk, staring at the case file in front of her. Each new detail she uncovered about the Jacobs family seemed to reveal a darker layer beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect life they had led. Samuel Jacobs had been revered by the church and loved by his congregation, but his family had borne the weight of his secrets. What had started as an investigation into a sudden death was now spiraling into a much more complicated case. The web of lies, affairs, and manipulation was tightening, and it seemed the Jacobs family had been living a lie for years. Daniels had just finished speaking with the twins, Emily and Ethan, who had reluctantly opened up about what they had witnessed. They knew about Samuel's infidelity and had seen their father with other women, including one of Natalie's close friends. It was becoming clear that Samuel had been living a double life, but it still wasn't enough to explain the motive behind his death. The question remained, what had pushed Natalie to murder her husband? Daniels decided to revisit the scene of the crime. The Jacobs house was eerily quiet, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the pain of the family's unraveling. She walked through the front door, past the framed family photos that once captured smiles and laughter. Now they seemed like a cruel reminder of the family's broken facade. Samuel's death was the catalyst, but it was the decades of secrets leading up to it that had set everything in motion. In the living room, Daniel studied the spot where Samuel had been found. The medical examiner's report had indicated blunt force trauma to his head, but there was still something missing from the investigation. No signs of forced entry, no struggle outside of the head injury, nothing to suggest that anyone had broken into the house or that Samuel had been attacked by someone outside of his immediate family. It was clear now that Natalie had killed him, but the why and how still didn't add up. She took out her phone and called Officer Rodriguez. "I need you to meet me at the Jacobs house," she said. "We're missing something. I'm going to need you to check the garage and the yard for anything unusual." An hour later, Rodriguez arrived and followed Daniels through the house. They started with the garage, an area where the family had stored items they didn't use often. It was dark and cluttered, but as they sifted through the boxes, something caught Daniel's eye. A small, half-empty bottle of sleeping pills tucked away behind some old furniture. She picked it up, holding it up for Rodriguez to see. "Do you think Samuel took these?" Rodriguez asked, his brow furrowing. "It's possible," Daniels replied, "but the bottle looks too new to have been used for long." It's worth noting, though. They continued to search the garage, but nothing else stood out. Daniel's thoughts raced as she walked back into the house. She remembered something Natalie had said during her interview, the way she described her husband's behavior in the days leading up to his death. There had been no signs of illness, but what if Samuel had been using the pills to numb himself from the pressure he had been facing? What if he had been trying to control his own demons, even as he tried to control everyone around him? Later that day, Daniels received a call from the coroner with the final toxicology report. There were traces of alcohol and sleeping pills in Samuel's system, but it wasn't enough to kill him. The cause of death was still the blunt force trauma to his head. It was clear now that Samuel had been incapacitated before the fatal blow had been struck. But who had struck it? Natalie was the obvious suspect, but there was still the possibility that someone else had been involved. The twins had been silent on the matter, and Natalie had refused to speak further when questioned about the details of the night. Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Daniels decided to confront Natalie one last time. She knew that Natalie was hiding something, and it was time to push her for the truth. She met with her again in the quiet of the evening, hoping to catch her off guard, to see if any new details would slip out. "Mrs. Jacobs," Daniels began, sitting down across from Natalie, who appeared more composed than she had in their previous meetings. "We've been through this before, but I need to know everything. Your husband didn't just die in his sleep. He was killed. You know that, don't you?" Natalie flinched but quickly regained her composure. "I told you, Detective, I never meant to kill him. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want him to hurt our children, to keep ruining their lives. I wanted it to stop." "You've said that before," Daniels pressed, her voice calm but stern. "But you still haven't told me how it happened. You didn't just go into his room and hit him in his sleep. You had to have done something else, something to incapacitate him first. What did you do, Natalie?" Natalie looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't mean to do it. But when I found out everything, when I saw the things he had been doing, the lies, the way he treated our children, I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to make him understand, to make him see how much he had hurt us." Daniels leaned forward. "What do you mean, make him understand?" "He wasn't just having an affair," Natalie whispered, her voice shaking. He was using our children. I walked in on them once. I saw him with Emily. He was touching her. I couldn't believe it, but I saw it with my own eyes. I couldn't let him destroy them anymore. I couldn't let him ruin them like he ruined me." Daniel's breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. Samuel's affair had been more than just a betrayal of his wife. It had been a twisted abuse of power, something that had scarred his children. The truth was far darker than Daniels had ever imagined. As Natalie's confession sank in, Daniels felt a wave of disgust and sorrow. Samuel had been more than just an unfaithful husband. He had been a predator, using his power over his family to manipulate and control them. And in her desperation to protect her children, Natalie had resorted to murder. But in doing so, she had destroyed everything she had worked so hard to protect. Daniels left the Jacobs house that night with a heavy heart. The investigation had turned from a simple case of infidelity and betrayal into a tragic story of manipulation, abuse, and ultimately a mother's desperate attempt to protect her children from the horrors they had experienced. The road to justice for Samuel's death was clear now, but the price of truth had been high. As the investigation continued, Daniels knew that this case would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about understanding the consequences of secrets too terrible to keep and the lengths to which a mother would go to protect the ones she loved. But in the end, even the most well-intentioned actions could have irreversible consequences. And the truth, no matter how painful, had to come to light. Detective Claire Daniels sat in her car outside the courthouse, watching as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. Her mind was heavy with the weight of the case. After weeks of uncovering secrets, betrayal, and a tragic death, the pieces of the Jacobs family puzzle had come together. Samuel Jacobs, the beloved pastor, had been murdered by his wife Natalie in an attempt to protect their children from his abuse. It was a crime that had been committed out of desperation and fear, but it was still murder. Natalie had confessed, but now the question remained. What would justice look like for her? Daniels had spent the past several days meeting with the prosecutor's office, preparing for the trial. There was no doubt that the evidence was damning, and Natalie's confession, along with the shocking details about Samuel's abuse, painted a clear picture of a woman driven to the edge. But the complexity of the case, the emotional turmoil, the trauma that had shaped the entire family, made it difficult for Daniels to reconcile the legal aspects of justice with the human emotions at play. The courtroom was packed the next day as Natalie Jacobs stood before the judge. Her once pristine appearance was now worn, her face tired and pale, as though the weight of the truth had finally caught up with her. She had spent the last few weeks in police custody, but this was the first time she was facing the full consequence of her actions. She was not just defending herself, she was defending her children, their safety, their future, and ultimately, her broken family. The prosecutor, a sharp and seasoned attorney named Carla Andrews, was ready to make her case. She stood before the jury, her voice clear and powerful as she presented the details of the case. Samuel Jacobs' affairs, his abuse of his own children, and how Natalie had witnessed it all. The photos, the testimonies, the confession, it was all in place to ensure that Natalie would be held accountable for the murder of her husband. But Carla knew this wasn't just a case about murder. It was about the collapse of a family, about a mother trying to protect her children in the only way she knew how. It was about the horrors behind the perfect life that Samuel had built, and the consequences of living in a world where appearances mattered more than truth. As the trial unfolded, Daniel sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the scene unfold. She had already seen the evidence, heard the confessions, and now she was seeing the toll the case had taken on the people involved. Natalie, who had been so composed in her previous interviews, now seemed broken, a shell of the woman who had once been a loving wife and mother. She had made the hardest decision of her life, and now she was facing the full weight of it. The defense attorney, a man named Charles Kingsley, painted a different picture. He argued that Natalie's actions had been a result of emotional trauma and years of abuse, both from her husband and from the community that had placed such high expectations on her. Samuel had been a man of power, and Natalie had lived under the crushing weight of his control. Her actions, Kingsley claimed, were not premeditated. They were a desperate act of self-defense, an attempt to stop the horrors her family had been enduring. It was a compelling argument, one that stirred sympathy in some of the jurors. Daniels watched the reactions of the jury, noting the small signs of hesitation. Kingsley was a skilled attorney, and his defense was based on a truth that no one could ignore. Natalie had been a victim of abuse. The trauma that had shaped her had driven her to kill the man who had caused her so much pain. The trial continued for days, each testimony adding layers to the story of Samuel Jacobs' twisted life. The more Daniels listened, the more she realized how deeply Samuel's actions had infected everyone around him. His family, his congregation, the entire town. No one had seen the man for who he truly was. They had only seen the image he had crafted for them, and when that image was shattered, the consequences were devastating. As the final days of the trial approached, Daniels found herself reflecting on the complexities of the case. It wasn't just about finding a murderer, it was about understanding the deeper currents of abuse, betrayal, and love. Natalie had murdered her husband, but in doing so, she had saved her children. Was it possible to reconcile the two truths? Could the law see past the circumstances and grant her mercy? Or would justice demand a heavier price? On the last day of the trial, the jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom was filled with tension as everyone waited for the verdict. Daniel sat quietly, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her. She had done everything she could to uncover the truth, but now it was out of her hands. It was up to the jury to decide what justice truly meant for Natalie Jacobs. When the verdict finally came, it was a mix of emotions. Natalie Jacobs was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury had acknowledged the abuse, the manipulation, and the fear that had driven Natalie to take her husband's life, but they also recognized the loss of life and the damage done by her actions. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison, a sentence that seemed light compared to the gravity of the crime, but it reflected the unique circumstances of the case, the trauma, the protection of her children, and the shattered life that had led to the act of violence. As the trial came to a close, Detective Daniels found herself standing outside the courthouse, watching the last of the reporters file out. The case had ended, but the impact of the events would ripple through Clearwater for years to come. The Jacobs family would never be the same again. Natalie, once a loving wife and mother, would now serve her sentence in prison, paying the price for her decision. Emily and Ethan, who had witnessed their father's abuse, would now grow up without their mother, their lives forever marked by the legacy of the secrets that had consumed their family. For Daniels, the case had revealed the complexity of human nature, how love, fear, and betrayal could lead to unimaginable actions. The truth had been uncovered, but in the end, it was the price of silence, of pretending to be something you're not, that had caused the ultimate tragedy. As Daniels walked to her car, she realized that justice wasn't always clear-cut. Sometimes it was about understanding the circumstances, about seeing the hidden pain beneath the surface. And in this case, the truth had come at a heavy cost. It was a quiet evening in Clearwater, Florida, as Detective Claire Daniels sat at her desk, reviewing the final case files from the trial of Natalie Jacobs. The town had begun to move on from the scandal that had rocked the Jacobs family, but Daniels couldn't shake the weight of what she had witnessed. The case had been one of the most difficult she had ever worked on, not just because of the murder, but because of the brokenness it had revealed beneath the surface. A mother had killed her husband to protect her children, but in doing so, she had forever altered the course of their lives. There were no clear winners in this case, only loss, pain, and the long road to redemption that would be difficult to navigate. Natalie had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence that was lighter than many had expected, considering the gravity of the crime. The jury had acknowledged the trauma that had driven her actions, but they had also recognized the irreversible damage caused by her decision to murder her husband. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, there had been no tears from Natalie, no outbursts. She had stood there, silently accepting her fate. She had always been the woman behind the scenes, the one who kept the perfect image of a family intact. But now that image was shattered. Her family was broken, her future uncertain, and her role as a mother and wife was forever changed. Daniels had spent days reflecting on the case. She had seen the hidden truths emerge about Samuel Jacobs' abuse, the twisted control he had exercised over his family, and the devastating toll it had taken on everyone involved. But there was still something that gnawed at her, the lingering question of whether Natalie's actions had truly been the result of self-defense, or if it had been something more calculated. Had she simply been trying to protect her children, or was there a deeper, darker reason for her silence and her decision to kill? The investigation into the Jacobs family had revealed a tragic pattern of manipulation and abuse. Samuel Jacobs had been a man who used his power and position to control those around him, including his own children. Emily and Ethan had witnessed their father's actions and had lived in fear for months, possibly years. But there had been no way to know how far Samuel's abuse had gone, how deep the scars ran, until it was too late. Now, with Samuel gone, the children were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Daniels had kept in touch with the twins after the trial. Emily and Ethan had been sent to live with their aunt in a neighboring state, far away from Clearwater, where they could begin to heal. The trauma they had experienced at the hands of their father was something they would carry for the rest of their lives, but there was a flicker of hope in their voices when they spoke to Daniels. They wanted to start over, to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of the Jacobs family name. They were, in their own way, finding a path forward. Daniels knew that Emily and Ethan's recovery would take time, years perhaps. The scars of their past would never fully fade, but they had a chance to live their lives without the constant fear of their father's manipulation. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one available to them now. As for Natalie, Daniels wasn't sure what the future held. She had acted out of what she believed was a desperate need to protect her children, but in doing so, she had caused irreparable harm. In prison, she would have the time to reflect, to process the decision she had made, but Daniels didn't know if that would lead to redemption. What Natalie had done could never be undone. The path to forgiveness was long and uncertain, and whether she would ever be forgiven, by her children, by herself, or by the world, was something only time would tell. Months passed, and Daniels found herself in a quieter place. The case was officially closed, and the town had moved on. But for Daniels, the emotional weight of the investigation stayed with her. She had seen the aftermath of a broken family, the consequences of living a life built on lies, and the devastating impact of silence. In her years as a detective, she had encountered many cases, but none had hit as close to home as the Jacobs case. It had shown her how deep secrets could run, how they could consume a person, and how, when left unchecked, they could destroy everything in their path. Daniels had often wondered what might have happened if Natalie had spoken up earlier, if she had reached out for help before everything spiraled out of control. But she also understood the fear that had kept Natalie silent for so long, the fear of losing everything, of being exposed. It was a fear that many people carried, especially those in positions of power or influence. But in the end, secrets always came to light. The truth had a way of finding its way out, even if it took years. As she looked out of the window, watching the sun set over Clearwater, Daniels felt a sense of closure, though it was bittersweet. The Jacobs family had been broken beyond repair, but perhaps there was hope for Emily and Ethan. Perhaps they could rebuild their lives, free from the shadows of their past. And as for Natalie, her journey was far from over. The road to redemption, if there was one, would be a long and difficult one. But it was a road she would have to walk alone, just as she had walked her life in silence, carrying the weight of her decisions. For Detective Claire Daniels, the case of the Jacobs family was a reminder that appearances were often deceiving, and that the truth, no matter how painful, would eventually be revealed. It was also a reminder of the importance of speaking out, of confronting the darkness before it consumed everything. The truth could heal, but only if it was brought into the light. Daniels knew that she had done everything she could, and now it was up to the Jacobs family to find their own way forward. The investigation was over, but the effects of the case would linger in her mind for years to come.